This again is for the attachment of ligaments and tendons, and oftentimes will be responsible for growth in width, right? Whereas the epiphysis is more for growth in length, right? There could be any growing going on. So here we've got an epiphysis, right? An apophysis here, medial epicondyle. Okay, but we're not doing extremities yet. So here's the physis, and then of course on the metaphyseal side would be the zone of provisional calcification. You can see maybe a little bit better here, a little increased density. Okay, so we're know the cortical bone, the maxillary bone. We didn't talk about metaphysis, diaphysis, epiphysis all that much in the cervical spine. Really, I don't know where it exists, if it does. We're not worrying about all of this stuff. These are just 7 categories of bone disease, don't worry about that. As far as the growth centers are concerned, remember the primaries are in utero and the secondaries are postpartum. And when it comes to atypical, not an atypical, because Atlas is atypical, but a typical vertebra, right, has 9. So just remember that you've got superior articular processes right and left, inferior right and left, transverses right and left, spinous process, and 2 for the vertebral bones. Right? So that is 9, regardless of what somebody else. Did somebody teach you 7? I heard from other classes that you were taught 7, but maybe they didn't take into account the vertebral bodies. Anyhow, we have synchondrosis here, right? So realize that these locations are where you can have persistent non-union. There's cartilage there, but it's not as strong as bone. So these are areas that could, you know, because of stress, become separated. So just kind of know where they exist. This one you're not going to have any trouble with. It would manifest as a spina bifida. And what do we call it if it's going to be C1, as this is? Spondyloschisis, right? Remember, if you go to Radiology Depot, or if you just go to the course, realize that there's a glossary of terms, right? So know some of those. Go to your dictionary or just go to Wikipedia, whatever, I don't care where, and make sure those that apply to the cervical spine you know, right? Because I could have definitions there. I'll provide the definition, and then I'll have the word that you choose from, right? I'm not going to have you, I could have you define it, that's a possibility too, but for the written, there will be, again, multiple choice, right? There will be true and false, and little brief fill in the blank, right? 1 or 2 words. No extended matching, right? I probably should introduce that, but I think I'm very limited as to what I can ask, just like I'm very limited in multiple choice. I mean, if I have a normal variant, A, B, C, D, that doesn't test you very well. I need you to tell me what it is. Okay, so again, remember, certain areas here, like we talked about an os terminale, right? That's because of persistent non-union, and there's cartilage, and it's not because of a fracture, it's just a separation of one component, an apophysis, from the parent bone. Also, at the base of the dens here, right? Realize we talked about os odontoideum, so you can have cartilage there, and the important thing, and as you go through the PowerPoint presentation, make sure that you can determine whether it's stable or unstable. You can't do that just by looking at a neutral lateral radiograph. You have to have flexion, you have to have extension to make that determination. So just look for, you know, occiput, C1, and the ossicle going back and forward, right? And look to the spinal laminar line to see what's going on there. Okay, so again, now we're into typical vertebrae. Again, there could be some issues here. I don't know that with a typical vertebra do I ever see at the pedicle, and that's what these areas are here, that there is a detachment. It can occur though. Okay, and spina bifida though you see with frequency. kind of know the projections a little bit, I could ask you, is this an AP, a lateral, or an oblique? You should be able to put that together in looking at the spine. Maybe more important when we get into a particular skeleton to talk about those things. Again, know your obliques. So these are lumbars, right? Not cervicals. So maybe, well, wait till I get there. Coming up. So realize that the posterior aspect of the patient relative to the bucky defines this as a posterior oblique. And the shoulder that's touching, in this case it's the right, would define it as a right posterior oblique. Here the left shoulder is touching, so left posterior oblique. Here now the anterior of our patient is facing the bucky. Thus it makes it an anterior oblique, and the left shoulder is touching, so the left anterior oblique. Blah, blah, right? So patient is positioned at 45 for your obliques. Neutrolateral, we commonly put the right or the left side, which is it? The left side, right? Always left side, whether it be cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine. If, however, they have a scoliosis, and let's say, for example, the scoliosis is your typical female thoracic, right-sided convexity, what side are you going to put to the bucky, the right side or the left side? It's got to be the right side. Okay, so you put the convex side of the scoliosis to the bucky, and you shoot, or have the X-rays directed into the concavity. If you don't, it's going to look like all those vertebrae are welded together. So you have to shoot into the concavity of a scoliosis, so that's important. Otherwise, you've got a retake, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so our lateral cervical. We said that the patient has to be in true neutral. So here we can see the posterior aspect of the hard palate. We're going to use that as a reference when we do our Chamberlain's line and our McGregor's line. So make sure that the hard palate is parallel to the bottom of the film, which is flat, and that's upon which the patient is standing. Okay, going from back to front at C1, we've got a posterior tubercle, and we don't have a spinal laminar line here, but we can say that we have an anterior aspect to our posterior tubercle. Then we've got a posterior arch, which attaches at a synchondrosis to the lateral mass, which is in here. Right? And then we have a very short, or nubby, anterior arch, and we have an anterior tubercle. We said that if this little crust or ridge of bone is missing, the anterior aspect of the posterior tubercle, that 100% of the time you've got what? Spina bifida, or we're going to call it spondyloschisis because it's C1, and we can use that term spondyloschisis at S1 and S2, and if you had multiple spina bifidas, you can say spondyloschisis as well. If we have a cleft in the anterior aspect of the tubercle, we have what? Usually a large anterior tubercle, usually a white anterior tubercle, and a very faint, I mean, there's no cortical, it's hard to see the, there is cortical margin. It's hard to see the cortical margin. So here you can see the cortex as being quite distinct all the way around the tubercle, but here it would be kind of faded out, right? And so realize that it's held together, right and left side, by cartilage, but there could be a cleft here and a cleft there. If you have a cleft in the back and the front of those arches, you've got a what? Meaning two, what means two? Bipartite atlas, right? Bipartite atlas. Right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
No.
I'm sorry.
When we wind back. Okay, so if you've got a cleft in the front and the back, right? Anterior tubercle and posterior tubercle, then you've got two parts then to your atlas, so it's called a bipartite, P-A-R-T-I-T, maybe an E French, I don't know, atlas, right? And think about it, you know, if a person would take a dive maybe into a shallow pool or something like that, because it's cartilage, it could be similar to reverse back to Jefferson, and you get it separating out of the house, right? It's possible. So it's an area that you need to be concerned about with treatment. Okay? Remember, this is not the articular pillar, or what was the other word? Lateral mass. This is the lamina, and the lamina houses the inferior articular process, the superior articular process, ocular articular body. Now you know the transverse process. Okay? You know, don't anticipate that because I asked for it on the quiz that it may not show up again on exams, right? Whether it be this one or okay, so, and then the pedicle you just can't see here, other than as a bright or a dense line, right? That's the pedicle. And it looks that way because the pedicle's kind of coming at you. We're only seeing this in one dimension, not three. Okay, so the pedicle we know attaches all of these posterior elements to the vertebral body. So going from back to front of the typical vertebra, we would have spinous process, spinal laminar junction, lamina, articular pillar, and it's okay to have that little notch, pedicle, and then vertebral body. And remember, the transverse processes come off of the body in the cervical spine, but off of the lamina in the thoracics and the lumbars. Just above where the pars interarticularis is, as we talked about earlier. Okay, so disc space, these are called what? These invaginations, we'll talk about them more again in the lumbar spine. Notochordal impressions, or if you want to call it invaginations. I've heard it called persistency, but invaginations or impressions make more sense. Or nuclear, right, like nucleus pulposus. And the nucleus pulposus really is notochordal remnant, right? So you either call it nuclear or notochordal impressions or invaginations. Generally, as you can see here, it's on the inferior end plate, not so much so on the superior end plate. Those are generally flatter. Remember, you've got an uncinate process, and that's what's adding the density to these disc spaces, and they occupy the posterior 2/3 of the sides of the end plate, or the sides of the vertebral body, right? Kind of like ear flaps pointing up or something, right? So maybe for that reason you don't get true lateral protrusion or extrusion of nuclear material, but rather posterior and lateral. Remember that C7 is the vertebral prominence only and atypical only because it has 70% of the time a spinous process that's longer than the others. Okay, so all of that stuff we've just discussed. Remember this, some people thought on the quiz that the peri or para-odontoid space was the predental space or the ADI. No, it's only on the lateral, atlantodental interval. You can't see it on the APOM. So this is referred to as the ADI, atlantodental interval, or pre, meaning before, right, predental space. It's okay if your atlas is angulated 12 to 14 degrees, more than that, it could be an extensional position. Sometimes the dens onto the body of C2, it can be as much as 15 degrees angulated posteriorly, and this one probably is to some extent. This is a little tubercle on the anterior aspect of the vertebral body, but we also have some rotation here, so part of this little bump here is because of the transverse process. Right? The foramen transversarii, if there's a little bit of lateral bending, you might could see because the transverses of C2 point down, and if you laterally bend, then you're going to shoot through the foramen transversarii. You can see the way. Here we can tell that there's rotation, right? Because the posterior aspect of the articular pillar we can see on one side and the other. It's not important which is the right or the left side, and I can't tell you, right, on the lateral. Now, if this was an AP, I could tell you, perhaps. Also, we've got two lines here, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us that those two vertebrae are tilted as well, right? So again, if my forearms represent the posterior aspect of the articular pillars, when there's rotation, they get out of sync, right? And then the syncopophyseal joints with lateral bending, they'll get out of sync, so you'll see two lines. So again, this denotes or demarcates rotation. These two lines, lateral bending. And we don't see that so much here, but we do see it in the upper cervical. So, okay, we said that this Well, we didn't really talk about this area here. We talked about the ABI. Sometimes this could be enlarged. Adenoids are in this area, but don't worry about it. I didn't give you a measure for that. I did give you a measure for this. I said that the predental space was how much in an adult?
7.
3 and 5
times 7 is
21 plus 1.
Anywhere from 20 to 22 is the
Oh.
retrotracheal space, the space behind the trachea and to the vertebral column. And here is 7. So 3 times 7, 21 is sort of in between 20 and 22. Okay, very good. Two lines that are extremely important here is this one here. We don't want you to call it posterior vertebral line. Nobody else seems to want to use that word or those words either, but they do call it George's line, right? At least in chiropractic, we call it George's line. And then the other one that is a hot ticket is the spinal laminar line, and another name for that is, some of you put that on the test, posterior cervical line. Don't confuse it with posterior vertebral line. That's George's line. So this is also called posterior cervical line, or it's called spinal laminar junction, or line. Okay, so I think you all now know that this is the articulation, right? Between the occipital condyle, there's the foramen magnum, and then this is the lateral mass here. So that space there is the articular space between the occipital condyle and the lateral mass, just as this is the space between the lateral mass and the superior articular process of C2. These little indentations here are called para, meaning beside, odontoid notches. They mean nothing, right? So we don't want you to confuse them with maybe a little piece of bone missing, you know, like a little chip fracture or something like that. So they're called paraodontoid. Where the posterior arch meets the lateral mass, that's called the synchondrosis. This would be the inferior aspect of the posterior arch. I think we're seeing the superior aspect of the posterior arch, and I sure as heck can't see the anterior arch because the base of the skull gets in the way. Right? And that's okay, this is still a good EQ of the bone. And then this is the base of the skull here, this is probably EOP, and a little wavy one is IOP, but I'm not asking you to make that distinction. Okay, so you've seen this one already. Most of you got points for this, you had the right answer. A few people talked about the dens, and I didn't see how that fit, but this is just to make sure that there's no malalignment between the lateral aspect of the lateral masses and the lateral aspect of the body of C2, as might relate to fracture or whatever. Okay, so you've got all of this stuff. Here, go back to this. Here was the pedicle, most of you got that. Again, if on the test I've got something that's obscuring what you want to see, look to the other side, or look above, look below, and see if you can find a comparative structure. I'll point that out though. We don't have any projections that are like this other than on CT or MRI. Again, paraodontoid notches. Here now you can probably see the superior aspect of the anterior arch, and then the inferior aspect of the anterior arch and the superior aspect of the posterior arch. It's hard to distinguish one from the other. Normally, the posterior arch is lower than the anterior arch because atlas is angled. Right? You would look at the lateral. This is the lamina here between the pedicle and the spinous process, then spinal laminar junction and spinous. And again, the inferior articular process comes off of the lamina of C2, whereas the superior articular process is adherent to the body of C2. Okay, please, people were still telling me that these lines here were vertebral arteries. You never ever would see them because the plaque that would be in the vertebral artery isn't dense enough to predominate over the density of the articular pillars, right? So those have to be the laryngeal cartilages. That includes the thyroid, cricoid, arytenoids, all that kind of stuff, right? Okay, these little bumps here were the unsnapped processes. Most people got those in the quiz, right? These are the pedicles, right, which become nicely identified circles when you get into the thoracics and the lumbars. Here, sometimes they're obscure, but still look there for them. The transverse processes of C7 shouldn't point beyond the transverses of T1, and usually at C7 they point horizontally or down, versus the transverses of T1, which point up and back, and usually have a rib articulated with them. Not unusual to see an unfused apophysis on the transverse processes of T1. That happens quite readily. Okay, so all this stuff you should probably know. Okay, so here we are with our obliques. All right, so a left posterior oblique. If it's a left posterior oblique, you're going to see what IVF.
Left.
The
Oh, right, sorry.
If this were an anterior oblique, if this was a left anterior oblique, then you would see the left. But if it's a posterior oblique, you're going to see the IVF opposite to the shoulder that was touching the film. So that would make that right. So then just identify the IVF. Everything around the IVF has to be right stuff, and then everything in front of the IVF, for the most part, is going to be left stuff.